first name is Jed, J-E-D, last name O-R-M-E, Orme. I served in the U.S. Air Force, 5 years of active duty and 8 years in the reserves. I was the navigator for 5 years active duty and then for 5 years in the reserves.
What led you to joining service?
Well, originally I was actually trying to get into pilot training, and I'd gone to school 1 year in college and got a private pilot's license. I was studying aeronautical engineering, and then I applied for the Air Force Academy, and I also applied to attend aviation cadet pilot training. I got accepted into a pilot training class, and the Air Force Academy is the first alternate from the state of California in the year 1959. And unfortunately, I shouldn't have done that. I could have done one or the other for the Air Force. And when my earlier assignment to get into a pilot training came up for the Air Force Academy decision, they wouldn't release me to go into pilot training because they still had me as an applicant to come into the Air Force Academy. So by the time I got released by the Air Force Academy, I didn't get into either. And I ended up having to take as a backup, they offered me to go into navigator training. So that's what I did. Then at that time, you could also go through navigator training, which was a little over a year, and then immediately go into pilot training. Midway through my navigator training, the Air Force changed that policy, and you had to serve 3 years as a navigator before you could go into pilot training. So my roommate did exactly that. He ended up a colonel in the Air Force and a pilot and a C-5 squadron commander. But I decided after 3 years I wasn't going to go back into pilot training. I decided to leave the Air Force, 3 years of active duty, leave the Air Force and go back to college. And 2 years I finished college. In 3 more years, I went to law school.
Did you end up getting your pilot license to fly at all?
Yes, I still have the pilot's license. It's not current because I haven't taken the medicals that you need to do. And now I'm at my age, I'm not sure if it would still be valid. But they told me when I stopped doing any flying myself that in order to keep the license active, I would have to get an annual physical.
Okay. And then you said after your time in service, you went to law school, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What type of law did you practice?
After I wanted to do aviation law, one of the professors in my law school told me about a couple of programs where I could do postgraduate studies in aviation law. And I got a fellowship to go to McGill University. They had an Institute of Air and Space Law, and I went there for a year and then got a job offer to work for the Airline Trade Association down in Washington, D.C., and I did aviation law.
That's really cool. So when did you first start to see problems that arose because of your time in service after you had served?
I was told that my hearing, I barely passed the audiology test. At that point, I was already transferring to the Judge Advocate General Court, which is what I did my last 3 years in the reserves. It was as a JAG officer. My hearing problem became more pronounced over years as I worked as a lawyer. If I was in court doing anything, and somebody would whisper something to me, I couldn't hear them. So I realized I was having some serious hearing problems, but I got around them until the time I retired in 2002. But at that time, I was having significant hearing problems, and I started going to the Air Force to see if I could get treatment for the problems under the VA. So in 2005, I think is when I filed my first application for disability benefits for hearing problems with the VA. And finally, in 2007, after they did some more testing of me, they granted me a 10% disability. So that was my first involvement with the VA.
And then from there, when did you start to experience problems interacting with the VA?
Well, in about another 2 years after that, 2010, I think, they increased my hearing, even with what they were doing was still getting worse. And so they gave me a 20% disability. And that was all I had for about another 10, 20 years. And when I was probably in my 50s, I started having breathing difficulties and other problems, some chest pains and other things. And I was diagnosed, and my primary care civilian doctors said I had a coronary artery disease. And so I went back to the VA and applied for Agent Orange benefits, and they denied it. And I fought with them for some time. And finally, in my 70s, they agreed to give me a 60% disability for coronary artery disease. And they added the 20%, and then using VA math, they got to a 70% disability total rating. And that's what I had for some time. And then as my condition got worse, and I became aware of the TDIU method of getting 100%, I filed both to have my original 60% increased to 100%, or to be considered to be eligible for TDIU, because I hadn't worked at all during the entire period that I was retired. And they, of course, denied that. And then I found out about the Hill and Ponton folks. I had a good friend, a navigator I flew with, who was also got out and became a lawyer over in San Diego. And he's the one that steered me to pursue the TDIU, because he was actually handling claims for other veterans in San Diego. And he thought I would qualify. And he suggested I find a good law firm. He said there were none in his area that he would recommend. And when I went online, I found the Hill and Ponton seemed to have the most activity in providing online information to veterans. That is how I found out about Hill and Ponton. I sent a letter or email, I can't remember now, asking if they might be able to help me.
That's amazing. And so when we stepped in, what is one of your favorite things about having us have your back with all this?
I had 35 years experience of working with outside law firms when I was an aviation lawyer. I was basically the general counsel of a couple different airlines and a company called DHL, Worldwide Express, an international air express company. What impressed me probably the most about Hill and Ponton, after working with many outside lawyers, was the qualifications that I could see that the firm clearly had. And I was particularly impressed by what I read about and saw being done by Matthew Hill. When I asked for their assistance, and I was informed that I would be able to get assistance and that Matthew Hill would be involved in that process, I was very, very pleased.
That's awesome. I don't really have too many more questions. Is there anything specific that you would want to talk about that I might not have touched on?
Not really. I guess the only thing I would like to add is I was really impressed by the ability to reach out and communicate with people like Carrie Baker and some of the other lawyers that were. But Danielle Pastor was the real highlight. She was just with me, helping me all the time, keeping me informed. And so I never felt abandoned or that I was not an important client to the firm, even though the benefits that I obtained with your assistance didn't provide what I would consider terribly large legal fees for your firm. But I still got a great deal of assistance and attention, even though I was not probably one of the clients that generated very, very significant legal fees.
Now, my last question is just simply, what was your favorite plane to fly and why?
Oh my gosh, without a doubt, the C-141 jet transport. I flew as a navigator on two different airplanes, the C-118, which is a DC-6B. Then when I started flying in the reserves, while I was in college and law school, each summer I would go on active duty up at Travis Air Force Base. So for 3 months, I would fly as a navigator on the C-141. And then on the weekends, every 2 weekends a month, I would fly. We would go from Travis to Hickam and back. So I got 5 years of experience of flying on that airplane, and it was just amazing. And what was most impressive was the mission we had, which was supporting the war in Vietnam. And I think the most significant thing that I did was to serve as the navigator on many flights where we were bringing back the wounded as well as the deceased. That, to me, was the only thing I think I can say I really do that contributed to my time in the service. That was a real benefit, both to me and to the people that were on the airplane.
Well, thank you so much for your time and spending it with me, answering my questions, and thank you so much for your service.
Well, thank you very much.